I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Last Call for Tuesday, the 21st of July. I'll be back with Heads Up Wednesday, 10 a.m. To the RMA, a survey of local authority heads shows most still have economic growth and investment as their top priority, but two-thirds, 68%, also say it's their hardest challenge. Some 60 mayors and chairpersons of 60 rural, provincial, metropolitan and regional councils responded to the survey conducted by law firm Simpson Grierson and Local Government New Zealand. The results, which show little change from the 2014 survey, were released yesterday at LGNZ's annual conference in Rotorua. A slightly lower proportion, 66%, said funding and affordability were the main impediments to achieving these goals, a level that is also consistent with last year. But opinion on government intervention as an impediment has risen from 15% in last year's survey to 29%. A question on consistency of government lawmaking affecting the sector and an impediment was a high 61% last year, but has dropped to 43% when reworded to inconsistency of central government policy making and legislative changes. Some of these changes involve the Resource Management Act. A majority, 54%, of elected council leaders think the RMA is unbalanced, and 93% of these say it tilts too far in favour of the environment and not the economy. This accords with the government's view, yet the reforms lack support in Parliament, with all political parties except National and ACT saying they oppose any change. Other major issues seen as offering the biggest challenges were transport and infrastructure affordability, 31%, water resources and management, 26%, and environmental impact and sustainability, 22%. Housing affordability rates lowest at 7%, reflecting this as an Auckland problem only. Most respondents want reform of the rating system, and 80% agreed the mix of funding options available to local authorities needs to change. A substantial portion of council leaders, 70%, also back the government's plan for national plan templates and restrictions on third-party participation in the decision-making process for plan changes and resource consents. Simpson Grierson partner Jonathan Salter, who compiled the report, says the respondents' comment indicate this is because well-resourced submitters have too much power over councils and applicants. Mr. Salter quotes one anonymous respondent as saying the process is too easily hijacked by objectors who simply want to frustrate and slow the process in the hope that the applicant will just walk away, and too often they do. Let's talk foreign capital. Auckland-based Squirrel Mortgage's chief executive John Bolton says New Zealand is having the wrong conversation about housing ownership. Mr. Bolton says the country should not be worrying about the foreign ownership of houses, but rather about the inflow of foreign capital and where it's being invested. He says foreign buyers are not flooding the housing market, but foreign capital is. His comments come in the wake of Prime Minister John Key indicating the government might tighten the screws on foreign ownership if data on the tax status of buyers shows overseas buyers are at a scale the public is unhappy with. Mr. Bolton says the government keeps misdirecting the conversation. This isn't about foreign buyers, it's about foreign capital coming into the country, with by far the majority controlled by foreign-born New Zealand residents. Mr. Bolton says much of the money is coming from their families, friends or loans and could be as high as 30 to 40%. Money can change hands on a handshake without contracts. He says whether it's a New Zealander or foreign national on a property's title doesn't matter. It's the source of wealth that needs tracking. The government is lifting the deposit required on investment properties to 30% and making foreign buyers have a New Zealand bank account and IRD number. The Prime Minister says if the government feels further steps are needed, it is prepared to look at them. Mr. Bolton says slapping even more restrictions on foreign buyers, as other countries have done, isn't going to help. He says it hasn't worked in other countries. Sydney has some of the highest priced real estate in the world. He says making foreign buyers have a bank account here and an IRD number will slow the buying process down and put some buyers off. But the biggest single impact will be the 30% deposit for investment property. It will have a big effect and should slow the market down. Squirrel Mortgages deals with thousands of mortgages every year, and foreigners using cash to buy bread and butter housing is an urban myth, according to Mr. Bolton. He says cash transactions do happen, but they are few and far between. He says by far the biggest investment by foreigners is in development land or projects. Kiwis haven't got the same access to money for large-scale housing or commercial projects. It's coming from overseas and making a big contribution to the country's housing stock. The government's immigration policies mean the country has massively changing demographics. As a result, a lot of money is coming into the country, and with a world awash with cash, we can expect a bigger slice of the pie. Mr. Bolton says in reality, New Zealand is a country of farms, motels, restaurants and houses. Where does most New Zealanders' money end up? In housing or some sort of property development or investment, he says. There would be little capital coming here to be invested in the share market, bonds or businesses. Hayes Gold Fund Chief Investment Officer Craig Robbins says New Zealand is ripe for more foreign capital flowing in. China, for example, has about $4 trillion worth of reserves, most of which is sitting in US, European and Japanese treasuries. He says New Zealand will get a good slice of this as Chinese investors look for countries to park their capital. Let's talk land. Development of Whenuapai rural land into 600 to 800 housing lots has been stymied by a lack of water. Unimpressed property barrister and Veranda Group chairman Andrew Guest says he's been told by Watercare, an Auckland Council-controlled organisation, water infrastructure can't be supplied to the area for 3 years. Mr Guest's company did due diligence on 100 hectares of flat farmland at Whenuapai that could have been bought and developed immediately to help alleviate Auckland's housing shortage. It hasn't gone any further with the possible deal. He said, "We are experienced developers and it's ridiculous other services are at the gate and Watercare can't come to the party, particularly when they're charging a $12,000 infrastructure growth charge, another name for a water connection, to every new house or extension on an existing property." He said the city is crying out for more housing stock and land for new developments. How long does it take to dig a trench and lay pipes? Veranda Holdings is developing 115 hectares of flatbush farmland on behalf of New Zealand Chinese investors into a 1,500 section $1.2 billion housing development and is continually looking at land for other housing projects. While the company continues its quest for development land, Aucklanders are being asked to give the council a steer on where and when they want 1,100 hectares of greenfields land developed for housing over the next 30 years. During that time, the council will provide infrastructure costing an estimated $13.7 billion to get the land spread from Warkworth in the north to Riverhead in the northwest and Pukekohe in the south development ready. Who's going to pay for the infrastructure has been left out of the picture. But a couple of months ago, the council knocked back applications for 3 greenfield special housing areas around Huapai in the northwest until the government stumps up with some money for transport and infrastructure development in the area. The 3 requested SHAs would have had 230 sections, but Deputy Mayor Penny Hulse said at the time the council received a clear message from locals they did not want more people living in an area with terrible roading and no way of getting down the northwestern motorway on public transport. Ms Hull says developer contributions cover only some of the costs of new subdivisions. The rest of the downstream costs are covered by ratepayers and they do not want bigger rate rises. The council has turned its attention to SHA applications on brownfield sites as they already have good levels of infrastructure services, but she says the government still needs to help shore up the funding for roading, water and electricity supply. The huge blocks of proposed new housing development land within the rural-urban boundary are together equivalent to 1.5 times the size of Hamilton's urban area. Ms Hull says the scale of infrastructure required is enormous. She says obviously we can't develop everywhere at once, so we have to make choices on the order and timing to make these areas development ready. She says we want Aucklanders' input into sequencing. The council has prepared a draft strategy for the mainly rural land that's zoned future urban under the proposed unitary plan. Blocks targeted for housing are at Warkworth, Wainui, Silverdale Dairy Flat, Whenuapai, Red Hills, Kumiu Huapai, Riverhead, Takanini, Opaheki Drury, Karaka, Parata and Pukekohe. Ms Hull says accommodating growth comes at a significant cost, and Aucklanders' input into the final version of the strategy will provide greater clarity and certainty about where and when future greenfields land will be available for housing.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. The Crown and ACC sue in the Caymans to wind up the Kerr Fund. Kiwi cereal maker accelerates expansion. Net migration hits a new record. Local councils float their funding wish list. And just how much is the Apple iWatch going to cost you in New Zealand on launch? To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 21st of July. I'm Andrew Patterson and this is Property Talk with me, Sally Lindsay and Chris Hutching. Welcome to you both. Chris, to you first. You've been following the council, the local government council conference, which has been happening in Rotorua. Seems to be plenty of ideas to find ways to tax people even more, Chris.
Well, that's right. And before we even move on to the tax issue, let's just hop back a second to some of the press releases that have been emanating from this conference, Local Government New Zealand Conference. The first one that I received yesterday was all about the very first remits that are passing, and That involved such things as wanting to ask the government to outlaw smoking outside cafes, restaurants and bars because someone there thinks that that's terribly important. The other one is they want to ask the government to impose a compulsory levy on plastic shopping bags at the point of sale. Somebody's awfully worried about that. The third one was a request for government subsidies for wastewater and water schemes for at least $20 million a year. Then fourth on that wish list was asking the government if they could rate Crown-owned properties. Good luck to them. The other thing that came out of the biggest thing that's probably come out of it is the usual wish list that we have every other year from local government New Zealand about ways in which they can rort us further in taxes. And of course they've come up with all the usual sort of ones, which is local road user charges, levies, fuel taxes, all this sort of stuff, and trying to do away with rating exemptions for certain categories of land. Now, of course, what is glaringly absent to all of us is any notion or discussion of ways of disciplining expenditure in these councils. This is all about all the things that we can do to ruin people's fun and tax them as much as we possibly can. It's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. And, it just shows us where the thinking of all these people is. So I'll get that bit off my chest. I can't really see anything much productive coming out of this because I cannot see any government going along with this nonsense.
No focus on how they perhaps reduce expenses?
No, and of course you're never going to get that because the councils are, like the fox is in charge of the hen house, so it's just never going to happen. Now, without giving away too much, I think Sally's going to be writing about this in the Friday paper, so it should be rather interesting to read her article on that.
All right. And Sally, to you, you've been focusing on the land development options, particularly this development at Whenuapai, not all straightforward.
No, it certainly isn't. While the council has asked all Aucklanders to have a say on where and when it will develop 1,100 hectares of greenfields land over the next 30 years, a developer has found 100 hectares out at Whenuapai that he could buy and immediately develop into 600 to 800 housing lots. But when he went to Watercare, they said they couldn't provide any infrastructure to the it's farmland at the moment for another 3 years. So of course this doesn't impress him at all, especially when the council wants people to say where and when they want all this land developed, and also want them to come up with $13.7 billion in the next 30 years to pay for all the water and other infrastructure to go on these areas.
Because, this is another part of all of this, isn't it? That in the end, you have to have everybody moving at the same speed to get the outcome that you want. And 600 to 800 houses in the scheme of things would be a decent number of houses for Auckland right now.
Well, it would, and they're already developing 1,500 lots out in South Auckland, so another 800 out in North Auckland would be really good and help the housing situation. But as usual, there's always excuses for not doing things, and it just comes back to all these council entities actually being in control and coordinating and actually being able to do what people want. And this doesn't happen. It comes down to what Chris has just been talking about, spending. So while they want to spend $13.7 billion on infrastructure for all this land, they've never said where this money is coming from. So I presume everybody will get taxed, rates will go up, because and developers will actually have to pay a large chunk of this, of course, but it doesn't cover all the costs. So, but as usual, there's no any information for people to actually really have a say about that, because apart from saying where they want the development to go, they do need to have a say on what else they want around the area.
All right. Chris, you've been looking at this Nigel McKenna development in Queenstown, Kawara Falls, evolving into a residential development. This has been an ongoing saga, hasn't it?
Yeah, now Nigel got this thing going back in mid-2000s there. I remember, I think I was invited down to Queenstown, and he had quite a few launches of this thing. It's a lovely area, a little bit out of town from Queenstown. It faces north. It goes up a hill, a slope, so a lovely spot to be, and it's right in front of the river as it runs out of the lake at Kawerau Falls. Now, Nigel's plan was incredible. Even at the time, I thought it was incredible. He showed us models of the way in which this relatively small site was going to be absolutely chock-a-block full of apartments and hotel accommodation. Well, in the end, some of it got away. The Hilton has built a hotel there, and plus one next door, and I think there's an apartment building there too, which they may manage as well. But there's quite a bit of the land that's left over, and there's a couple of parcels that are around about 4,000 square metres, which are now being sold off, or have been sold off, and the people that have sold them are cutting them up even further into smaller lots so that people can have nice sections there. So what was going to be a commercial accommodation zone has sort of evolved a little bit from that. Now, what happened to Nigel there after the GFC is not totally uncommon. There's a development I'm just looking at for a story this week about Marsden Cove, and that was set up by a fellow called Scott Oliver, and that is basically the same sort of thing. Got caught out by the GFC. He managed to get the roading in, although I believe that there are some issues around some engineering problems there as well. But now the whole thing's up for mortgagee sale. So that's quite an interesting little item there. I do note that most of the property press seem to have swallowed the agent's line quite unquestionably, and have not actually looked behind the scenes to see why this block of land is for receivership sale. But we'll tell you all about it on Friday.
All right, looking forward to that. Sally, been looking at the apartment issue in Auckland, suggesting it needs the whole issue needs a rethink.
Yes, well, architects Warren and Marnie think it does. Of course, they design apartment blocks for developers, and their executive director says with intensification actually going to happen in Auckland, there does need to be a rethink away from just great big huge concrete blocks and not much design and not much flexibility for people living in these apartments. And they said, intensification out in the suburbs could easily be done with 4 to 5 storey well-designed buildings that make space actually private for people. Let them move walls within the apartment, give them a little outdoor living area with grass, and it would be very successful. But they said the cost of building, the cost of land, and the building supply chain need a complete rethink.
We don't see a lot of that condominium-style development that you see in the US in the suburbs around places like Auckland, do you?
No, but we have a lot of NIMBYism here, so every time someone says they're going to do a development like that, all the neighbours complain and take them to the Environment Court, and invariably the development doesn't go ahead. And under the unitary plan, there's been scraps all over the place in just about every suburb about not wanting intensification and not wanting big apartment buildings. And in some ways you can't blame them, but there's nothing wrong with 4 and 5 storey buildings with nice medium-sized apartments, not shoeboxes. We don't want shoeboxes again, but there's nothing wrong with living like that.
And it's a very effective use of the land as well too, and it doesn't create, I think, many of the problems that perhaps people are concerned about.
Well, there were a lot of social problems in other countries when they built these huge apartment blocks and just shoved people in them, and some of them were social housing and some were rented and all that. And you're asking for problems. But if you've got a nicely designed, low-level apartment block, they're usually very well looked after, usually owner-occupiers, and people are very happy in them. And there have been some good ones built in Auckland and no doubt in Christchurch and other areas. But it's when you just get great big huge apartment blocks that are mainly rented owner-occupiers are nowhere to be seen. You get problems and you get social problems.
Well, we have had one or two. We have had a bit of a change in Christchurch, Sally, because we've under special legislation, as you may recall, under the SERA Act, and that has allowed Jerry Brownlee to push through land use changes, which actually do allow a lot more density in this very central city area. And there was an interesting little story the other day of a couple of people living in a nice wee cottage, and a building was built next door, and now out the window, the north-facing window, all you can see is this building. It's low level. It's only 1.5, I think, but it's so close. In the winter months, there's absolutely no sunshine whatsoever.
And they're looking at a blank wall.
Yeah, which is, the kind of thing that I'm sure you really want to avoid no matter where you are.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Now, finally, talking about Christchurch, Chris, the rebuild appears to be nearing its peak.
Well, if you drive around the city, it's the most bizarre experience around town. You're trying to get from point A to point B. It's like snakes and ladders. It's incredible. Every other street is closed off with roadworks. You can only go part way up one way, and then you've got to go around another way. I was trying to get across town yesterday. It was just unbelievable. I shouldn't have bothered. I should have taken my bicycle. I was just feeling a little bit lazy. But anyway, so it's all going gangbusters, and it's got a fair way to go yet. Only about 1/3 of the buildings that were KO'd in the central city have been replaced so far. So when we say we're reaching the peak, it's a bit of an unknown quantity because we don't know quite how many buildings are going to be rebuilt. But we've got a wee way to go. Things are flattened out. Brownlee & Co. I'm not going to rush ahead with this convention thing, so, that'll extend out any construction further out too. SERA is trucking along doing its thing. They demolished a near-new building this week, and that's because it was in the way of some road widening for Manchester Street that they want to turn into a slow boulevard for cyclists and pedestrians mainly. Cars will be allowed to go along at about 20 km an hour if they're lucky. I can't for the life of me understand why they couldn't have somehow accommodated this building there, because it's going to be slow road. So I mean, what's the problem if you've got, a slight obstruction coming out from where you would ideally like it? They're going to have concrete abutments coming out all over the place. So it's cost New Zealand taxpayers about $4 million to buy that property and to demolish it. So that's just a little bit more of SERA's common sense that we see around the city that we would like to talk about.
Right. Thank you both for joining us. That's Property Talk for another week. Thanks to Chris Hutching and Sally Lindsay with us on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. Free to air online with business news you can use.
In market news, Pine Gould Corporation Director Russell Naylor has been fired as Chief Executive of ASX-listed Lantern Hotel Group. The Australian pub operator told the stock exchange yesterday it had terminated its management agreement with Mr Naylor's company, but did not give a reason for the decision. Mr Naylor will be paid 6 months' pay in lieu of notice. On Friday, Mr Naylor announced Lantern had sold one of its properties, the 51-room El Toro Hotel and Motel in Western Sydney, for $24 million Australian dollars. According to the Australian Financial Review, Lantern's board was surprised by the sale announcement, and the transaction was a major factor in Mr Naylor's departure. Mr Naylor and Lantern could not immediately be reached for comment. Lantern, 33% owned by the PGC-controlled Torchlight Fund, was the subject of a boardroom coup last month as dissident shareholders ousted directors associated with PGC, Brian Mogridge, Mr Naylor and Deborah Cartwright. New directors John Murphy and Graham Campbell were appointed. At the June shareholder meeting to vote on the directorships, then Chairman Julian Davidson announced that Mr Naylor's position as Chief Executive had been formalised with a management services agreement requiring a 6-month notice period because the board thought it was prudent to ensure that it could, if it wanted to, continue to have Russell's services. Mr Davidson resigned on June 29. As well as its 12 Australian hotels, Lantern still owns 2 properties in New Zealand after selling the Waikanae Hotel to Greater Wellington Regional Council for $2.6 million last month. Property records indicate its other 2 properties are the Albert Sports Bar and the Office Bar in Palmerston North. PGC shares were quoted at 34 cents on the NZX today, valuing the investment company's equity at $70.5 million. Let's talk A2 milk. A2 Milk's managing director says the company isn't at odds with its largest shareholder, Freedom Foods, over strategy and that it doesn't need to raise further capital. Jeffrey Babbage also says Freedom's takeover bid in conjunction with US-based Dean Foods isn't compelling. A2, having just listed on ASX, had been at an advanced stage of launching a capital raising when the Freedom Dean bid emerged. A condition of that to which A2 agreed was that A2 not raise capital in the meantime. But now Mr. Babbage says his company is fine without new capital. He says we've been consistent in saying we have a very strong cash flow being generated out of the Australian business. With nearly $10 million in cash on the balance sheet and standby debt facilities available, he says we're in a place where we don't need to raise capital. But then he goes on to say that certainly the board was considering a capital raising on the back of strong interest being expressed after the ASX listing. A number of Australian institutions had expressed interest in becoming shareholders, he says. In other words, A2 doesn't need more capital but was going to raise it anyway. Now it's not, even though the bid which caused it to shelve its capital raising plans is unacceptable. A2 is in the process of launching into the US market, a move one would expect to need considerable resources. Mr. Babbage says, based on our current business plan, we're confident we have the capacity to fund that. He says if there are opportunities to turbocharge A2's growth, A2's board would reconsider. If Mr. Babbage's comments seem contradictory, Freedom's actions look very odd indeed. Mr. Babbage previously worked for Freedom Foods and took on A2's top job in 2010 when Freedom sold its half of its Australian joint venture back to A2. When it reported its first half results in February, Freedom, which is listed on the ASX, changed the way it classified its investment in A2 to being available for sale. Its rationale then was that it had only one director on A2's board following the retirement of Perry Gunner last November when significant influence was deemed to be lost. At that point, Freedom owned 17.9% of A2. Freedom had been gradually selling down its holding from the 25% it gained in 2010 in exchange for its interest in the joint venture. Surprisingly, in June, Freedom's 57% shareholder, Tony Perich's Arrowvest, which already had a small holding in A2 in its own right, said it had bought a further 6.9 million shares for nearly 3.3 million Australian dollars between late March and early June, taking the combined Freedom Arrowvest stake to 19.1%. Later in June, A2 announced it had received an expression of interest from two associated parties who asked that their identity be kept secret. Further, these parties stated that their expression of interest is indicative and non-binding and may be withdrawn if it ceases to be confidential. That at least proved to be an empty threat, because 2 days later, after the ASX began asking questions, A2 revealed the bid was from Freedom and Dean. Now Mr. Babbage says his board can't recommend the Freedom Dean expression of interest, but is willing to keep talking to them about it. He also says A2 has received other confidential inquiries indicating potential interest in the company and is in the process of evaluating them. To the share market, GeoOp, the workforce management app, will migrate from the New Zealand Alternative Index to the NZX main board after flagging the possibility of further capital raising to fund its growth. The company said in a statement it will apply to the Wellington-based stock exchange operator to graduate from the minnow bourse to the main board. GeoOp, which is in the middle of shifting its balance date to June 30 from March 30, reported annualised revenue rose 72% to $1.4 million at June 30 from a year earlier. GeoOp is foregoing profits and dividends as it invests in product development and chases customers. The company is counting on capturing market share through the growing use of smartphones, where its app can be used by small and medium-sized enterprises to manage their workforces. In May, the company flagged it was considering options for a capital raising, and today said no firm amount or structure has yet been determined. The board expects to update shareholders in due course. At March 31st, the company had $2.5 million in cash and short-term deposits, down from $4.5 million a year earlier. The company raised $10 million at $1 a share in a private offer before listing on the NZAX in October 2013. The shares last traded at 40 cents and have fallen 56% over the past 12 months. GeoOp's move to the main board skirts NZX's new market NXT, which targets small to medium-sized enterprises with a less onerous disclosure regime and lower listing costs. Currently, G3 Group, a mail service business, is the only listing on NXT, which will eventually replace the alternative index.
NBR Radio. With Hotel de Brett, your home away from home, but with better service. NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 21st of July. I'm Andrew Patterson. Well, New Zealand is having the wrong conversation about housing ownership, according to Auckland-based Squirrel Mortgages Chief Executive John Bolton. He says the country should not be worrying about the foreign ownership of houses, but rather about the inflow of foreign capital and where it's being invested. Foreign buyers are not flooding the housing market, but foreign capital is. And John Bolton joins us now. Thanks for your time. What's the basis of this? Because you're not specifically seeing evidence about a lot of cash buying of urban houses at the moment.
I mean, we certainly see a little bit of anecdotal evidence of, foreign buyers in the New Zealand market, but where we see that tends to be more in terms of development type lands and bigger projects, which isn't a bad thing, because we need the capital to build all the houses and stuff in Auckland. So that side of things is fine. The argument that foreigners are buying up all the residential property is really misleading, and we seem to have this. We seem to be having conversations at the moment where everyone's talking at each other, and the conversations aren't necessarily lining up. So, we obviously had the information released by the Labour Party that said, people with Chinese surnames are buying 40% of the property, and then, we have other statistics that say foreign buyers aren't buying up the country, and so therefore Labour's wrong, and no one's talking about the same thing. And just as an observation, as a mortgage broker and as one of the largest mortgage brokers in Auckland, the reality is that a lot of the buying activity that is occurring in this market is involving money that's coming from overseas. But ultimately, it's New Zealand residents that are buying.
So from your perspective, in terms of what you're seeing, based on the actual evidence of the transactions that you are putting through the company, what is the picture that you're painting in this area?
That money comes in from overseas is nothing new. We're a country where, we have net immigration. We've got people arriving in New Zealand all the time. Immigration policy tends to bring people either in with, specific skill sets or, high net worth individuals. And I guess what I've sort of said, Kiwis have had a passion for property investment, since time immemorial. So there's nothing really new here. But with the amount of people that we've had come into the country over the last 10 to 15 years, and the access to capital that they have from offshore, a lot of the purchasing activity that is occurring here is basically involving, deposit funds that are coming from overseas.
You say also that much of the money is coming from their friends, families, loans, and that could be as high as to 30 to 40% of that, and that money can change hands on a handshake without contracts. What's your concern around the the foreign capital issue as opposed to foreign buyers?
The difference between, say, a Western nuclear family where the family relationships aren't very strong, and Asian communities, and that's not just Chinese communities, but Indian communities, pretty much most of Asia, and I'd imagine other parts of the world as well, is that the family ties are a lot stronger. So if I was to go and buy a property, I would be pretty pushed to get any money out of my parents. It just doesn't happen that way. And when my parents retire, there's no expectation that I'll look after them. There's no expectation that they'll come and live with me. In fact, my parents living with me is about first thing from my mind. And that's the way that, I've been brought up, and that's the way that I operate. In Asia, it's very different. I mean, they pour huge amounts of investment into their kids. And that's not just people living in China or people living in India. Even in Asian community in New Zealand, they really invest heavily in their kids. And there's generally an expectation that they'll get looked after as they get older. So it's just a different way of thinking. And when you combine that with potentially one-child families, as there's a bit of, particularly in places like China, you combine it with just trying to help the kids get started, potentially in a new country, then, there is access to capital. And I guess it finds its way into property. And we've seen that for a long time. There's nothing new here. New residents to New Zealand are bringing their deposits from overseas. I guess the issue is when, it's more than just buying an owner-occupied property. It's buying 2, 3, 4 properties, often with fairly large deposits. Then you sort of start to see, perhaps new residents having a disproportionate effect on the market.
Do you then believe that New Zealand should have any controls around foreign capital coming into the country, particularly when you think in, I guess, around the size of New Zealand?
Look, it probably generally isn't too bad. This is a much bigger issue. I mean, we know that this isn't just going on in New Zealand. This is going on around the world at the moment. The complexity for Auckland is it's a very desirable place to live. And, we've got this background story about having a lack of houses for the amount of people that are coming into the country. So, on the one hand, you'll have a discussion about, shortage of houses, a problem we've got to solve is the Resource Management Act. We've got the council, we've got to solve this, the building costs are too high, we need to build more property, we need to free all of that up. And that's all true, because even with, the foreign capital coming into the country, if we're building fast enough, we could probably absorb it. But what we've got is we've got capital coming in and we've got a low building rate, and so you've got high demand for property that's just continuing to push house prices up. And fundamentally, I guess we come back to this and we sort of say, well, we've got high house prices and my goodness, they're going up at a great rate of knots at the moment. And that's really scaring people. And we've got to solve that. It's not one issue. It's a whole series of issues. One of them is the amount of capital that's coming in from overseas. Now, the Reserve Bank started to, obviously put some extra controls around this. In terms of these LVR restrictions that are going to come in from the 1st of October, the IRD numbers and making sure that we're getting proper ID for people that are buying property, both residents and overseas people. Now, all of these things combined are going to have an influence. Whether they'll have enough of an impact, is yet to be determined.
And just finally, I guess the other point you were making is that a lot of this foreign capital is then used for subdivision development. So ultimately, there is an ability for it to contribute to the ultimately building the supply of available housing stock.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not all capital is bad. In fact, lots of capital are good. One of the interesting things with New Zealand, and it's not something I see a hell of a lot of discussion about, is that, we are a small economy, and, it's actually pretty hard to buy a business here, unless you're buying a motel or a cafe. I mean, you just look through the papers and see what's for sale. You can buy a franchise, a motel, a cafe, and it's very hard to, come to a new country and set up a business from scratch. So, when you're bringing in large amounts of capital, I'm not surprised that it has to find its way into commercial and residential property. I think, from what we're seeing, some of the bigger chunks of money that we're seeing coming in from overseas are certainly related to new development. And I think that's a good thing. Anything that helps us start building more houses has got to be good.
Thank you for joining us and for sharing the insight. Speaking to John Bolton, Chief Executive of Auckland-based Squirrel Mortgages on NBR Radio.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
In technology news, Apple has confirmed its watch will be available from July 31st in New Zealand and revealed New Zealand pricing. The cheapest model, the Apple Watch Sport, will sell from $599, the standard version from $949, and the Edition range, which includes frills such as gold plating, will sell from $17,500 to $30,000. Anticipating unfavourable comparisons with US pricing, Apple has taken the unusual step for it of including the amount of GST in each watch's price. The $30,000 model includes a GST component of $3,914. Even if you're happy dropping $30,000 on a timepiece, consider that Apple typically releases upgrades to its major products once a year. And when Apple Watch 2 comes along, likely slimmer and with better battery life, the first models could lose a lot of their value. Apple is due to release its quarterly result tomorrow New Zealand time, but the company has already flagged that it will not include watch sales. The US business press has piled into the void, with one report claiming Apple Watch sales have tailed off 90% since launch and are now as few as 10,000 a day. Apple has made no comment, but it's unusual for the company not to have released some kind of brag statement about early sales by the 3-month mark. In commodities, oil has dropped below US $50 a barrel in New York trading, and gold is falling to a 5-year low as commodities respond to selling pressure. Spot gold traded down 1.9% at US $1,113.19 an ounce, as the prospects of a rise in official US interest rates increased. Copper, silver and platinum also fell. Gold futures prices plunged at the end of last week as stronger economic data boosted investors' expectations the US Fed could raise interest rates as early as September. August futures settled today on Wall Street at US $1,106.80, a fall of 25.10 US or 2.2%. The price briefly went below US $1,100 an ounce, the lowest since April 2010. Crude oil prices for August delivery settled at US $50.15 a barrel, the lowest settlement since April the 2nd, after slipping as low as $49.85 a barrel earlier in the session. The more actively traded September contract closed down 77 US cents or 1.5% to US $50.44. Brent, the global benchmark, fell 45 US cents or 0.8% to 56.65 a barrel on ICE Futures Europe. The price drop reflects strong output from the US and other nations in an oversupplied market. Although oil consumption has risen this year, many analysts say demand is insufficient to eat away at the global glut of crude. The recent Iranian nuclear deal added to the prospect that more crude oil could be produced in the coming months. The oil market is also sensitive to currency moves. A stronger US dollar makes oil more expensive for non-US buyers. To Greece, Greece's embattled banking system received some relief as loan repayments were made overnight and banks opened after a 3-week shutdown. The Greek government completed a €4.2 billion payment to the European Central Bank and paid off some €2 billion in arrears to the International Monetary Fund. This follows an agreement with Eurozone ministers to provide Greece with a desperately needed short-term bridge loan to pay the debt. However, tight restrictions on money flows remain, with limits on cash withdrawals and capital payments. But depositors are allowed to bundle their €60 daily withdrawal limit over several days and take out a cumulative €420 at the end of the week. The reopened banks are also limited to basic services such as making domestic payments in person, which customers have only been able to carry out online in recent weeks. The branch openings help those who don't have access to online banking. Clients can now access their safe deposit boxes again. Consumer prices and services rose as value-added tax rose from 13% to 23%, one of the measures passed last week as a condition of a debt bailout agreement. Talks can now begin on the terms of a tentative 3-year bailout deal struck for up to $86 billion in aid. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras' government is bracing for renewed parliamentary defections from his left-wing Syriza party as it prepares to enact a second round of measures to restore financial stability. The Athens Stock Exchange, whose operation was suspended June 29, remained closed on Monday, and it was unclear when it would resume trading.
NBR Radio with Baileys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
NBR Radio on Tuesday, the 21st of July. I'm Andrew Patterson, and with me, Tim Hunter. Tim, 2 government-owned companies have taken legal action in the Cayman Islands seeking to wrest control of a $250 million fund from NBR rich lister George Kerr. Just give us a bit of background to how this has come about.
Yes, and it's a complicated background, all right. So these 2 companies, Crown Asset Management Limited, which we tend to call Camel, and ACC, which is the big fund manager for the ACC fund, they are suing for the wind-up of this fund in the Cayman Islands alongside another Australian outfit. And the allegation is basically that the fund isn't being managed properly and they want to liquidate it and get their money out. So the strange thing is, though, that this is a private fund and one of the typically secretive private equity limited partnerships that operate very much in the background. And we don't tend to hear anything about activities of these types of investments at all in the public eye. But strangely enough, the taxpayer has ended up with what we believe to be quite a sizable interest in this fund, which is called the Torchlight Fund. Camel, as I understand it, has about $30 million in it, and the ACC about $2.2 million. Now, these stakes appear to have arisen as a result of the failure of South Canterbury Finance a few years ago. Camel took over the assets of the remaining assets of South Canterbury from the receivers in 2012. And so Camel's job is to realise as much as it can from the assets of South Canterbury Finance and a number of other finance companies that fell over in the crisis. And they found themselves as owners of apparently a bit of a stake in the Torchlight Fund.
And this potentially will create a windfall benefit if they are able to wind this fund up?
Well, that's right. In theory, it should be cash coming back to the government as a result of the wind-up of the fund.
Because there's still quite a shortfall from that South Canterbury wind-up, isn't there?
There is, yes. They have managed to realise quite a bit, but there's still lots of money outstanding. I guess one of the difficulties here, though, is that one of the claims in this court case in the Caymans is that the supposed assets of the fund are not necessarily borne out by reality. So, in theory, we can calculate that it might be worth around $250 million on paper, but there is a question mark around that valuation, and certainly it appears that the investors are not certain that the fund is actually worth as much as that.
What about the fact that NZX-listed Pine Gould Corporation owns 27.8% of Torchlight? Shouldn't the company have been informing the market of these developments?
Absolutely. In my opinion, it should. This case was filed back in June 25th, and it clearly has implications for a listed company such as PGC, because it owns a big stake in the fund, and it also gets management fees from running the fund, because PGC owns the general partner and basically is controlling it. So PGC is effectively the one that is being ousted from the management of Torchlight if this case is successful. And we've heard not a peep from PGC about the implications of this, which for a listed company in financial terms are substantial.
And of course, 28% is a reasonably material interest.
It is indeed, yes. I mean, they've said that it's worth, I think, to them, £30 million. Which is obviously 60 million plus in New Zealand dollars. So that's a very sizable amount of money. And one of the difficulties here again is that the investors are alleging that they've had no audited accounts from this fund since 2013. And you really have to wonder how PGC can be reporting its results to the NZX when it hasn't had proper audited accounts of this major asset on its books.
All right. Now, what about reaction from the Financial Markets Authority?
This is something that we haven't heard officially about, but it is my understanding that the Financial Markets Authority has been probing the affairs of Torchlight since, at least February this year. It's not clear whether it's come to any conclusions on that. It's possible that it may be making a decision on that imminently. And it remains to be seen whether this is a matter of legal interest to the FMA, but they've certainly been trying to find out what has been going on.
And I assume no comment from PGC Chairman George Kerr?
Not as yet. He's not the chairman of PGC. He's the managing director, but we haven't been able to reach him as yet. But we hope to shortly.
All right. Thanks for joining us. Tim Hunter with us on NBR Radio.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. The Crown and ACC sue in the Caymans to wind up the Kerr Fund. Kiwi cereal maker accelerates expansion. Net migration hits a new record. Local councils float their funding wish list. And just how much is the Apple iWatch going to cost you in New Zealand on launch? To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. Let's talk cereal. Kiwi cereal maker Smart Foods is about to shift into a new factory that will treble production capacity as part of a 5-year plan to boost revenue to $50 million from $15.7 million by jumping on a trend towards healthier eating. Smart Foods, which has around 50 staff, has grown at a compounded annual growth rate of 36.5% since its first full year of trading in 2005 and 6, and exports account for more than a third of revenue. The company's current St John's factory is nearing capacity, and Smart Foods is shifting to a 5,600 square metre Mount Wellington site, costing $2.5 million to fit out, which should accommodate growth for at least the next 5 years. The company has the licence to manufacture Vogel's branded cereals in New Zealand and China, makes a Hillary branded cereal range where royalties go to the Ed Hillary Charitable Trust, and will launch its own branded cereals in the next 2 months. Chief Executive Justin Hall started Smart Foods in the kitchen of his Parnell, Auckland home in 2003. He gained the licence to manufacture Vogel's cereals, beating out Goodman Fielder, which makes Vogel's bread. Kellogg's acquired the licence for Vogel's cereal and snacks in Australia, where Smart Foods sells private label cereals to supermarkets. Mr Hall's wife, Vicky Taylor, joined the company a few years later when it reached sufficient scale to take the manufacturing from contract to in-house. While the company can apply to extend its Vogel's licence to other countries, it had an unsuccessful foray into the US market with a gluten-free cereal. Mr Hall said the 5-year strategy focuses on 3 markets, New Zealand, Australia and China, rather than being distracted by the many opportunities in front of them. Mr Hall said one thing that evolved as part of our strategy was finding the right market opportunities to chase. There's a lot of good ones and then some great ones, and we have to be clear about those because we only have so many resources to focus on a few key areas. Julian Davidson, former CEO of Independent Liquor, joined the board last month as an independent director, and Mr Taylor says he's got a good sounding board as the company rapidly grows. What has got us to here, it's not what's needed to keep expanding the business to that next stage. When you first start out, you have to disregard what people tell you or you'll never do it. You have to believe in yourself. At some point, you reach the next stage of growth where you have to start listening to other people and be prepared to take advice. It's a pivot point where you say, what do we need to be doing differently? Mr Hall said they'll continue the same funding path for growth out of cash flow, bank debt and a number of angel investors, and he has no plans at this stage for a share market listing of the private company, which he and Taylor majority own. Let's talk council funding. Local Government New Zealand, which represents the nation's 78 local authorities, wants greater flexibility in the way its members fund their operations, with property rates too limited to address the changing economic and demographic challenges facing councils. The local government body today released a manifesto with 10 proposals it says will help authorities create incentives to support economic growth, and wants to set up special economic zones to try out new ideas, President Lawrence Yule told the LGNZ conference in Rotorua. The wish list includes proposals to drop mandatory rating exemptions for certain categories of land, examining ways to lift the uptake of rates rebates, allow road user charges, levies and fuel taxes to raise revenue for transport, introduce profit sharing with councils for local investment and on mineral royalties, and allowing tourism levies where appropriate. Mr Yule said in a statement, we need to put ourselves and our communities in the best possible position to manage significant issues such as regional economic development, demographic shifts, climate change and rapid technological advancement. LGNZ anticipates a productive and constructive discussion between local and central government, business and communities to address the proposals and to implement the solutions the communities need. In February, the body suggested new taxes and government support in a discussion document preceding today's manifesto, as it sought to overcome the gap between spending and revenue, where councils account for about 10.5% of public spending, but raise only 8.3% of all public revenue. LGNZ's 10-point plan says property rates on their own could never be an effective and efficient means for addressing the raft of challenges councils face, and that trial zones would let authorities tailor their responses to specific regional needs. The body recommends dumping statutory exemptions on conservation, health and education land, land used for charitable purposes, transport infrastructure land and Maori land, and instead putting it into the community on whether it wants to provide rates relief. It also plans to work with the Department of Internal Affairs to investigate why the take-up for rates rebates for low-income ratepayers is low, and look at how to improve the adoption of those schemes. LGNZ wants to introduce road user charges to help fund the maintenance and upgrading of transport infrastructure and better manage congestion. On funding requirements imposed by central government, the local authorities body wants councils to be consulted on the cost implications they might face from Crown decisions and to receive co-funding where policy aims to produce a national benefit. LGNZ also wants a local share of royalties on mineral extraction to recognise the infrastructure councils have to build to enable mining. The body also wants to implement targeted taxes and levies where visitor numbers put pressure on infrastructure and services, citing the successful introduction in Stewart Island. and it wants a review of developer contributions to help fund the provision of infrastructure created by a new development. LGNZ said it will develop a plan to push the manifesto and will start working on the proposals that don't need agreement with business or central government. In litigation news, 2 government-owned companies have taken legal action in the Cayman Islands seeking to wrest control of a $250 million fund from NBR rich-listed George Kerr. The action involves Crown Asset Management and big fund manager ACC, who acquired stakes in Mr Kerr's Torchlight Fund in the wash-up of South Canterbury Finance, which collapsed in 2010. The two are parties to a wind-up petition against Torchlight filed at the Grand Court of the Caymans by another Torchlight investor, Australian fund manager Aurora, as trustee for the Bear Real Opportunities Fund. How much is at stake is not clear, but NZX-listed Pine Gould Corporation, which owns 27.8% of Torchlight, has said its stake is worth 30 million British sterling, implying a total fund value of around 250 million. Sources close to Torchlight have previously indicated CAML has about 30 million in Torchlight, while ACC's stake is understood to be around 2.25 million. According to the petition, the Bear Fund, CAML and ACC have a collective interest of 89.9 million in Torchlight. That's Australian. The Public Trust and New Zealand fund manager Logic Funds Management have a further 5.6 million Australian combined interest and support the petition. The petition describes Mr Kerr as the de facto manager of the fund, as managing director of the general partner and 79% shareholder of PGC. It seeks a wind-up of the fund on the grounds that they and the supporting limited partners have justifiably lost trust and confidence in the general partner and Mr Kerr. The general partner is not conducting the affairs of the partnership in the best interests of the partnership and is acting in a manner prejudicial to the interests of the limited partners and or is acting with a lack of probity as the general partner of the partnership. The petitioners made several allegations of mismanagement, including that related party transactions involving Mr Kerr's interests were damaging to the fund and that no audited accounts had been provided since those for the year to March 2013 in breach of the partnership agreement. They also say the fund was transferred from New Zealand to the Caymans without consultation with the limited partners in late 2012 in a manner that changed the partnership agreement. They seek the appointment of liquidators from Borelli Walsh and PPB Advisory. Mr Kerr could not immediately be reached for comment. CAML did not respond to a request for comment. ACC fund manager Nicholas Bagnall said he could not comment as the case was before the courts.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform www.nbrtalent.co.nz. NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett. Open for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything in between. NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 21st of July. I'm Andrew Patterson. With me, Neville Gibson. Gold prices have plunged to their lowest level in 5 years. In his editor's insight today, Neville looks at the reasons and whether gold will rally again. So what's been the main reason for the gold decline, Neville?
Well, there's several reasons, but the main one is the prospect of the first rise in US interest rates in more than 9 years. This was prompted by US Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen was giving evidence at a House committee, and she signalled that the economy was nearing the point where a rate hike was justified, and she said that she preferred to move earlier and proceed slowly with these rate increases rather than do a big rise and try and catch up and move more aggressively. This triggered a huge drop in the gold futures on Friday, and they fell again today or Monday US time. It also pulled down a whole lot of other commodities that are denominated in US dollars because the dollar went up as a result. That's oil, copper and metals like silver and platinum.
What effect will this rise in rates have on gold and other investments, do you think?
Well, what the rise in interest rates means is that it brings to an end an extraordinary period of low rates around the world. While New Zealand has missed out on some of those, the printing of money through quantitative easing programs has been pretty controversial. Some would call it an experiment. It was certainly a unique response to the GFC, the global recession. Trillions of dollars were pumped into financial markets, and that pushed up asset prices, shares, but it also pushed up gold, which reached a peak of around about $1,900 in US dollars, that is, an ounce in 2011. Since then, as economies look like improving and that prospect of the interest rise has been looming all this while, gold prices began a real drop, and in trading earlier today they hit $1,106.80 an ounce, which is the lowest we've seen since March 2010.
Yeah, and all of that fear around rampant inflation, of course, ended up coming to nothing.
That's right, and there have been a lot of other factors at work there, like the US economy went through a bit of a freeze. We've had a lot of turmoil on world markets. We've had the Greece debt crisis, which may or may not have been resolved, and it certainly put the skids under oil, which was subject to a whole lot of other reasons, like huge production in the US and elsewhere. And of course, we've just had the Iran deal, so oil prices have dropped to under $50 US a barrel again today. So gold can't really keep up with that sort of thing going on in world markets.
Of course, it's all in the realms of speculation, but what do you think might be the course for gold from here?
Well, it's there's always a bit of a rally in gold. In fact, it happened in January and again in May as the US economy went through it. And no doubt the people who buy gold are waiting for any kind of volatility. But one of the other aspects that's come up just in the recent week, we've had the debt crisis being somewhat resolved in Greece, and of course the question over Chinese growth, but it was actually the Chinese central bank revealing its gold reserves for the first time in more than 6 years. These are somewhat of a mystery, but everyone was expecting them to be double what it turned out to be, which is around about 53 million ounces. Now, that's up some 57% since the last count back in 2009, but as I say, only about half of what the market was expecting.
So how did China's reserves compare with other countries?
Well, the biggest holder of reserves, of course, is the US. It has more than 260 million ounces. Germany, Italy and France are the other big holders, according to the IMF. But China now has bigger reserves than Russia and Switzerland. And allied to this is China's desire to use its gold holdings to become and back up the asset of the yuan. It wants the yuan to be recognised as a reserve currency like the US dollar and the Japanese yen, the euro and so on. And central banks have been selling down their euros. So the Chinese hope that presumably by saying we've got this gold, even if it isn't quite what people expected, we're still pretty serious in getting that currency change. The
Chinese don't have a location that rivals Fort Knox, no doubt.
Well, they have a lot of retail buyers, and there's no doubt a lot of people under the mattresses. But again, the retail buyers generally come from China and India, and they usually act on any. If gold goes down much lower than it is at the moment, you expect those buyers to come in. But India's going through a harvest period, and that's usually a quiet time for gold buying there. And of course, the Chinese investors are probably speculating on the share market and wouldn't have a lot of ready cash to hand at the moment.
Thanks for the insight. Neville Gibson with us on NBR Radio.
Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today. www.nbr.co.nz/subscribe. NBR.
To the UN, under Foreign Minister Murray McCully's chairmanship, the UN Security Council's 15 member countries have unanimously endorsed the nuclear agreement with Iran. Mr McCully said he hoped the agreement could form the basis for building trust and opening a new chapter of cooperation in the Middle East. He said, "We urge all parties, and in particular Iran, to approach implementation with the same positive intent and good faith that led to the agreement being concluded." The Council, whose 5 permanent members were among the 6 powers that negotiated the nuclear weapons freeze, has a key role in monitoring Iran's compliance in return for lifting economic sanctions. Beginning in 2006, the Security Council imposed a series of sanctions on Iran to stop its nuclear program under suspension that Tehran was seeking an atomic bomb. These included the sale to Iran of nuclear-related material, as well as on ballistic missiles and conventional arms, asset freezes on companies and institutions involved in the atomic program, and asset freezes and travel bans on individuals linked to Iran's nuclear development. With yesterday's resolution, the restrictions on procurement of nuclear-related material will stay in place for 10 years. Sanctions on ballistic missiles and the asset freezes on some individuals wouldn't be lifted for 8 years. The conventional arms embargo will be removed only after 5 years. The resolution allows any of the permanent members, US, UK, France, China and Russia, to use their veto to restore the measures if Iran is seen to be violating the nuclear deal. A new dispute resolution mechanism is available to deal with any allegations of violation of the agreement. The main obligations imposed on Iran are to slash the number of centrifuges it uses to enrich uranium to slightly more than 5,000, a reduction of 2/3. The unused centrifuges would be put in storage. Iran must dramatically cut its stored low-enriched uranium to just 300 kg from the present 10,000. That's far below what's needed to make a bomb. These restrictions will be in place for 15 years. Iran also agreed to redesign its Arak heavy water reactor so that it can't produce plutonium, which can be used in a bomb. US Ambassador Samantha Power told the Council after the vote sanctions will only begin to be lifted when Iran verifiably completes the initial steps needed to bring its nuclear program in line with the deal. To the courts, billion-dollar kiwifruit marketing organisation Zespri is reviewing an employment court decision over its imprisoned former employee's laptop computer because it says it raises important questions for all businesses. But it's still working to comply with the court's order, having failed to argue the laptop should be returned directly to Zespri ahead of the former employee's personal grievance claim against it. Last month, the employment court heard of a mutual distrust between the jailed Joseph Yu and his former employer Zespri over a laptop taken by Chinese customs. Mr. Yu worked for Zespri Management Consulting Company, or ZMCC, which was fined nearly $1 million after being convicted of underdeclaration of customs duties in China between 2008 and 10. He's serving a 5-year prison sentence after being found guilty of being an accessory to smuggling charges laid against ZMCC. Late last year, the American citizen filed a personal grievance claim against Zespri with the Employment Relations Authority. When Mr. Yu was detained in September 2012 at the Shanghai Pudong Detention Center, his laptop was taken by Chinese customs, which his family says has critical communications on it. The ERA made a direction in late December that his laptop, which requires Mr. Yu and Zespri's mutual consent to be released, be delivered to the authority for inspection by both parties' counsel. But in June, Zespri sought to reverse this order, saying the laptop is its property and needs to be returned to it, as Mr. Yu's employment contract states. Mr. Yu's lawyer, Philip Skelton QC, says Mr. Yu needs to have access to the laptop to help prove his case, and appropriate orders need to be made to protect both sides. The case was heard before Chief Judge Graham Colgan in the Employment Court at Auckland, who says the dispute centres on a mutual distrust between the parties about what each might do to the laptop by itself. And earlier this month, he rejected Zespri's unrealistic application, ordering both parties to take the appropriate steps to have the laptop sent from the Anti-Smuggling Bureau in China to the Employment Court in Auckland. It will be held there for an independent IT expert to clone the device, who will report on its contents before Mr. Yu can make claims as to any documents which should not be provided to Zespri. Zespri, however, says the judgment raises important questions of law about information ownership relevant to all employers. For more on this, nbr.co.nz.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 21st of July. With me, Chris Keel. Chris, you've been looking at the Vend story. Lots of rumours flying around the market, but the company's staying fairly mum about what actually is going on.
Yes, it's one of those stories where we could write a bit more about the rumours that are going around, but you've always got to be a bit careful. It seems from an email which was apparently sent to investors and then leaked that one of the things that's on the agenda for Vend is possibly another capital raise. We don't know what their cash situation is or the urgency, because quite uncharacteristically its CEO, Vaughan Rousell, hasn't wanted to comment on that. But into the vacuum, NBR readers have poured theories. So they raised around $20 million US last year, which valued the company about $100 million. So if they do raise more capital, people will be looking at what valuation. Will it be that amount or more, or could it be slightly less, which could dilute and devalue the shares of existing shareholders like Milford Asset Management and others, but we'll have to wait and see. Could be a higher valuation.
Any indication as to the timeline on these issues from here?
No, they're not saying anything. When Vaughan has commented on that before, he said they've been quite conservative in their spending and they've still got some money in the bank, and he was saying this in the context of they weren't in any rush to do an IPO, and there's still no suggestion that that's on the table. Hopefully it will be at some stage, as its current situation notwithstanding. It's one of our most exciting startups. They're doing cloud point of sale software. They've laid off a few New Zealand employees last week as they refocus and expand more overseas where most of their sales are. But it's one of our most interesting software startups.
Vaughan Rousell has been a very inspirational CEO for that company as well, and he may be, I guess, somewhat not cut from the typical cloth for a chief executive, but he's certainly popular within the company.
He certainly is. He's got a really unique, enthusiastic style, and I've got to say he's one of NBR's favourites. We've been following him since he was a one-man startup with one customer, who was his wife, her clothing shop. And he's always been a very quirky guy. When they opened their new office in Newmarket, he celebrated by shooting an old-style cash register with what seemed like a real gun. It was certainly
impressive,
very loud. So he's quite a unique individual. Great guy.
And the company has managed to corner a very interesting niche. I mean, in terms of point of sale of what they're doing, it's a growth market, and you see the number of particularly cafes and smaller retailers that that this has really found favour with them.
It has, and Newmarket seems like an unusual place for a software startup to plonk itself, but like Vaughan says, they're surrounded by their customers. So if you look at shops in the immediate area, they can just walk out the door and see people using tablets instead of conventional cash registers. So it's always good to be immersed and surrounded by your own customers.
And I suppose the other part, it's been part of this Xero ecosystem, isn't it? That Xero's sort of created these other companies that can plug into their software, and you create a much larger offering in total.
Yeah, they've plugged into the Xero ecosystem. That's been good. And Vend has also been, they've now got companies copying them every other week, but they were first into the cloud-based point of sale, and just last month, Apple took them on for a global promotion where it's going to have various tablet apps promoted in its bricks and mortar retail stores. And we've got Xero as the only accounting software app in that program, and Vend is the only retail app. So that's quite a good score for them.
What about the existing shareholding? It's fairly tightly held, isn't it, at the moment?
It is. Vaughan himself is still the largest shareholder, I think, and then he's got 0.9 Capital out of Berlin, who one of the earliest, Sam Morgan, and then Peter Thiel, who's of course also been Facebook, PayPal, Xero, so he's no chump, and also Milford Asset Management and investors out of Australia as well.
All right, we'll follow with interest the developments at Vend. Thanks for joining us, Chris Keel, on NBR Radio.
In market news, disgruntled Alliance Group shareholders have gathered sufficient support to force a special meeting to discuss the potential benefits and risks of a merger with fellow cooperative Silver Fern Farms. Belfer farmer Jeff Grant and rural accountant and farmer Gay Cowie have been gathering the required 5% of proxy forms needed to force the special meeting, and they say they've sent 7% to the company for verification. The move matches a similar one by Silver Fern Farm shareholders to force a special meeting within their own meat cooperative. Mr Grant said their campaign started off a bit slowly but gathered momentum last week, with proxies coming in from farmers they hadn't even contacted. He said he's spoken with Alliance Chairman Murray Taggart, who understood shareholders have the right to seek the special meeting where they can vote on a resolution for the board to provide shareholders with a full analysis of the potential benefits and risks of Alliance Group and Silver Fern Farms merging into one co-op entity, along with a comprehensive risk mitigation plan verified by an independent firm. As a long-term investor in Briscoe Group, Mr Grant said he's read more about its strategy and the direction of the company in the back pages of the newspaper than I've ever read about the strategy of the two meat co-ops. When you consider that farmers' shareholders' livelihoods depend on what goes on beyond the farm gate, they need to know more in terms of their own investment, what the future holds for them. He said not all shareholders support holding a special meeting, but it gives everyone a chance to discuss what lies ahead. Mr Grant said this debate has been going on at a reasonably heavy pace for the past 8 years, and not all shareholders agree. But if there are some benefits and synergies around procurement, processing and marketing, or amalgamation or a combination of those, we want to ensure as shareholders that the board is exploring those opportunities. He expects the special meeting to be held before the end of August. Alliance has consistently said it can't see benefit in merging with the debt-laden Silver Fern Farms, as at the end of last year, Silver Fern Farms' debt had been cut to $288.6 million from $387.6 million the previous year, and it's currently trying to raise $100 million of new capital. Any decisions made at the special meetings won't be binding on the meat company's boards. Meat industry reform group Meat Industry Excellence is still pushing its plan for a new export meat co-op that would park the debts of the two big farmer-owned cooperatives into a bad bank. The good equity would be put into a good bank and the two co-ops merged into a new company. In business news, Vend founder and chief executive Vaughan Rousel is refusing to comment on a market rumour his company is considering another capital raise. NBR Radio understands an email has been sent to investors canvassing possibilities. One investor expressed annoyance to NBR that it has apparently been leaked. A member of the investment community told NBR the point-of-sale software company is in the hunt for capital. But Vend spokesman Simon Pound would only offer, "We don't normally comment on capital raising, so we'll be continuing that." Vend has at times commented on its cash situation. The company hit the news last week as it laid off staff but would not say how many. In September last year, Mr. Rossell told NBR Vend had 172 staff, or roughly double that of a year ago. He said the company was seeking more hires. He saw staff numbers hitting 1,000 in a few years. The Vend boss has said 85% of his company's sales are offshore, but most of its staff are in New Zealand. Vend also has offices in Melbourne, San Francisco, Toronto, London and Berlin. The cuts are concentrated in New Zealand as the company rebalances. Vend has been one of New Zealand's more successful startups in the capital-raising stakes. It was initially backed by Sam Morgan, with Lance Wiggs and Rowan Simpson also coming on as early investors. In May 2012, it raised $3 million from Berlin-based Point 9 Capital, and in 2013 it raised $8 million. In March last year, in a deal that valued the company at US $100 million, Vend raised $20 million US from Australia's Square Peg Capital and the US-based Vala Ventures, the investment vehicle of Peter Thiel, the billionaire early investor in PayPal, Facebook and Xero. In September last year, Mr. Rousel said Vend's cloud-based retail software was being used by more than 12,000 stores. However, he would not give a paid versus free trial breakdown. According to a May 21st, 2015 Companies Office update, Mr. Rousel and members of his family own 22.95% of Vend, Point 9 Capital 16.66%, Sam Morgan 9.1%, David and Nicola Wilson 9.05%, Vala Ventures 8.9%, Milford Asset Management 6.77%, and Chairman Rowan Simpson 4.67%. A number of smaller holders include Lance Wiggs on 0.64%.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 21st of July. With me, Jason Walls. Jason, you've been looking at this ongoing issue about the register of foreign property interest. And interesting, an NBR Online poll suggests that the majority of NBR Online readers actually would support that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's how this this story was sparked. We run the poll questions online every couple of days, and we kind of gauge the readers' feeling in terms of certain stories. And this is one of the, well, certainly since I've been here, this has been one of the most popular ones that we have. And that's not surprising at all after the high amounts of exposure that this story has had in the last couple of weeks. And we actually saw that about 60% of the people that took part in this poll agreed with Labour's Phil Twyford, saying that we actually do need a public searchable register for foreign buyers. And so, I mean, we saw 60%, so that's quite a lot. That's a clear majority there.
Now, Nick Smith, the Housing Minister, has ruled this out. He says it will not be a register because it won't be searchable.
Yeah, and it's important to note that he says that a register implies that information will be publicly available on an individual property. So, I mean, he outlined to me that Landed Information New Zealand will be collecting the information, but he also says that on October the 1st, they will be given, the information will be analysed and given on a general but not individual property basis.
So what access will the public have to this information, if any?
It's unclear at the moment. I think as more comes out, I would have liked to get more information from Mr. Smith when I had contact. However, when I emailed back some further questions, they didn't get back to me in time for the print. But at this point, we have a bit of a snapshot about what's happening. And, of course, there's going to be more to follow of this in the future and a lot more information to come. But from what he said to me is that he's actually hit back against Labour, saying that because you'll remember that one of the things that Labour said was the reason that they released this information is because there wasn't anything that the government was keeping on foreign buyers. And we can see from our poll snapshot and our business pulse that a lot of our subscribers agree. However, he hit back saying that he doesn't accept that Labour's stunt, and he called it a stunt, was because of the lack of government data collected on foreign ownership.
However, with credit to Labor, they have clearly managed to get this issue finally squarely on the agenda.
Well, that's the interesting part about this. I mean, agree or disagree with what the means were to get this information on the table, we're all now talking about it. And it's been sort of moved from sort of the back of, well, not the back of newspapers, but it's definitely put front and center. And the debate around this has been huge. It's been extensive. There's been story after story. There's been commentary after commentary. And now it's the number one thing on people's minds right now. So it's definitely been propelled into the front of public discussion right now, which personally, in my opinion, is great, because as long as we get more information and more discussion around a huge issue like this, doesn't matter what Mr. Smith says about there only being, 1.2% or something like that foreign buyers is what he's saying. It doesn't matter as long as we're now talking about it and we're having an open discussion. I think that's the essential, it epitomizes the democracy, basically.
Is it your sense that the government's been caught off guard on this, that they're really having to try and address the situation somewhat on the hoof?
Yeah, well, this has come out, and there's no way that they could have seen this. I mean, in saying that, the person that did release the data probably, it might have made its way to national as well, so they could have had some indication, but I don't think they would have envisaged it blowing up to quite this level, and they're going to have to. They've got a lot to talk about and a lot to answer for in the next couple of days. So hopefully Mr. Smith is a lot more forthcoming, and hopefully we can get him on the radio. How about that?
Yes, all right. We will perhaps see if we can make that happen as well too. Thanks for joining us. Jason Walls, looking at the establishment, or perhaps Clayton's foreign property register that may or may not finally eventuate. More to come on this story. We'll be following it here on NBR Radio.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
In poll results, a majority of NBR poll participants say there is a need for a publicly searchable register of foreign buyers in New Zealand. But Housing Minister Nick Smith has confirmed to NBR Radio that the information that will be collected by Land and Information New Zealand, or LINZ, will not be a register. He says a register implies information will be publicly available on an individual property. The law change that is to come into effect on October 1 will enable the information to be analysed and given on a general but not individual property basis. Last week, Labour housing spokesman Phil Twyford suggested almost 40% of Auckland houses sold from February to April this year were to buyers with Chinese surnames, even though ethnic Chinese make up only 9% of Auckland's population. He told NBR Radio the reason he revealed the leaked data was because he felt strongly that the Kiwi dream of affordable home ownership is under threat. He said, "My beef in this whole dispute is with the government for refusing to take this issue seriously, for refusing to establish a register of foreign ownership of property and share that info with the New Zealand public." But Dr. Smith has hit back, saying he does not accept Labour's stunt was because of the lack of government data collected on foreign ownership. Asked why it's taken the government so long to respond to the public concern over the issue, Dr. Smith says the government announcement was made 2 months ago. Dr. Smith insisted earlier this week that foreign buyers are not having a significant effect on the Auckland housing market. He says only 1.2% of New Zealand housing stock is owned by foreigners. He said that number has been quite consistent for about the last 15 to 20 years. We accept that information's not perfect. That's why at budget time we introduced legislation into Parliament that's going to give us far better information. He says the bill is before a select committee and due to come into effect October 1st. Asked if Mr. Twyford was right about the need for a public searchable register of foreign buyers, some 60% of NBR poll participants agreed, with the remaining 40% disagreeing. To the courts, a former managing director in the retail gas industry who was found guilty of fraud of at least $9.75 million has had an application to appeal a $400,000 reparation order dismissed. Ronald Rosenberg and Sydney Hunt were last year convicted on 41 charges of dishonestly using documents following an investigation into retail gas supplier eGas. Rosenberg and Hunt deliberately underreported the quantity of gas supplied to its retail customers by approximately 950,000 gigajoules, amounting to fraud of at least $9.75 million. Former Managing Director Rosenberg was sentenced at the Wellington District Court to 3 years jail in May last year and ordered to pay $400,000 in reparation. His co-offender and the company's general manager, Mr. Hunt, who was bankrupt, was sentenced to 3.5 years imprisonment. Each charge had carried a maximum penalty of 7 years imprisonment. Rosenberg unsuccessfully appealed the reparation component of his sentence in the Court of Appeal, after which he sought leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court yesterday dismissed the application. Rosenberg had settled civil proceedings brought against him by the liquidators of e-gas before he was sentenced last year. He contributed $120,000 to the settlement and did not pursue claims of $4.55 million a company he controlled 60% of had in secured indebtedness against e-gas. This improved the recovery for unsecured creditors of e-gas from about 16% to 67%. As such, Rosenberg argued the sentencing judge did not take adequate account of the settlement and there was an unfair disparity between his sentence and Hunt's. But he told the court he would prefer the reparation order to stand if an appeal increased his prison sentence as a consequence. In the Supreme Court's judgment, Chief Justice Sean Elias and Justices William Young and Terence Arnold say they're not satisfied it's necessary to hear the appeal. It is clear sentencing judge Bruce Davidson was aware of the settlement and took it into account. The judgment says we do not accept the constraint that the applicant has endeavoured to place upon the court by indicating that if the court was minded to quash the reparation order and increase his term of imprisonment, he would prefer that the sentence be left as it currently stands. It is not appropriate that an applicant attempt to limit the court in that way. And for the full judgment, nbr.co.nz. In migration news, New Zealand annual net migration rose to a new record in June as arrivals continued to be bolstered by Chinese and Indian students, while fewer locals departed for Australia. According to Stats New Zealand, the country added a net 58,300 migrants in the year ended June 30, ahead of the 38,300 gain a year earlier in the 11th month, where the annual figure has racked up a new record. Migrant arrivals climbed 15% to 115,700 in the year, while departures fell 8.1% to 57,400. New Zealand's annual net migration already beat the Treasury's forecast peak of 56,600 and is closing in on the 60,000 figure used for the basis of the budget's economic upside scenario. Under that framework, the Treasury expected faster growth over the next 2 years as new migrants would fuel consumer spending before putting more pressure on the housing market. Inbound migration has been fuelled by a rising number of student visas, which rose 43% in the year to 25,800, of which 10,100 were from India and 4,900 from China. India was the third biggest source for long-term arrivals, with 13,300 in the year, a 61% increase from 2014, while China was the fourth largest with 10,300, up 16% on the year. Australian arrivals rose 9.2% to 24,100, while UK arrivals fell 2.3% to 13,500. On a monthly basis, New Zealand reported a seasonally adjusted net inflow of 4,800 migrants. Separately, short-term visitor arrivals rose 9% to 177,000 in June from the same month a year earlier, led by gains in Australia, Chinese and American visitors, who accounted for 61% of all arrivals in the month. Short-term arrivals rose 7.4% to 2.99 million in the year. New Zealand tourism was getting a boost with the recent decline in the Kiwi dollar, which makes it more affordable for foreigners to travel to remote places, and was bolstered by events such as the Cricket World Cup earlier this year and the more recent Under-20 FIFA World Cup. Bank of New Zealand economists yesterday noted the booming numbers of short-term visitor arrivals and predicted the June month would rise by between 5 and 10%.
NBR Radio with Baileys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.